My older brother called me from the hospital with a broken wrist, a fractured rib, and a voice so quiet I had to press the phone against my ear just to hear him breathe. When I found out the person who put him there was the woman he had taken into his home and called family, I drove 4 hours through the night to make things right. What happened next is something that woman will spend the rest of her life trying to forget. My name is Frank Delwood. I am 63 years old, retired Navy SEAL, and the kind of man who does not raise his voice because he does not have to. My brother Walter is 67, 4 years older than me, and the gentlest soul God ever put on this earth. He built a commercial roofing company from nothing, starting with 1 truck and a crew of 3 men in Knoxville, Tennessee. By the time he was 55, Delwood Roofing had 11 crews, contracts across 4 states, and a reputation that took 30 years to build. Walter never cheated anyone. He never cut corners. He shook every worker's hand on payday and remembered every one of their children's names. His son married a woman named, and I will only call her what she was, my daughter-in-law, because she does not deserve the dignity of her name in this story. She came into the family smooth and polished, the kind of woman who knew exactly what to say and exactly when to say it. Within 2 years of the wedding, she had talked my nephew into relocating to Denver for her career. Within 3 years, she was the one handling Walter's business correspondence whenever his arthritis flared up. Within 4 years, Walter's actual business attorney had been quietly replaced by a firm she recommended. None of us saw it happening because it happened slowly, the way water carves through rock. What I know now is that she had been planning it for a long time. Walter had a fall last October, a bad one. He was up on a 2nd-story deck at his lake house, inspecting some rotting boards he wanted to replace before winter. He went down hard and landed wrong, and ended up with 2 cracked ribs, a broken wrist on his dominant hand, and a concussion bad enough that he spent 4 days in the hospital. While he was still on the heavy pain medication, while he was still barely able to hold a pen, my daughter-in-law put a document in front of him and told him it was an insurance form related to the accident. It was a durable power of attorney. It gave her sole authority to act on his behalf for all financial and legal matters for as long as a physician deemed him incapacitated. Walter signed it because he trusted her, because he was drugged and in pain and she was family. By the time he was clear-headed enough to understand what he had signed, she had already used it to freeze his personal accounts, redirect company checks, and send a letter to his original attorney stating that his services were no longer required. He called me on a Tuesday evening in February. I was sitting on my back porch in Chattanooga watching the sun go down over the ridge when my phone rang. I almost did not pick up because I did not recognize the number. He was calling from a neighbor's phone because, he told me in that small voice, his daughter-in-law had put parental controls on his cell service, and he could no longer make outgoing calls without her seeing them on the account. Let me say that again. A 67-year-old man who built a company with his bare hands could not make a phone call without his daughter-in-law's permission. I asked him where my nephew was in all of this. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She tells him I am confused, that the fall affected my thinking." He believes her, Frank. He thinks he is protecting me. I set down my coffee cup very carefully on the porch railing. I asked him if he was hurt. He said the ribs were healing, but she had been controlling his pain medication, doling it out on her schedule, which sometimes meant he went long stretches without it when she was traveling for work. I asked him what he needed most right now. He said, "I just need someone to know. I just needed to tell someone who would believe me." I believed him. Here is the thing about being a SEAL for 22 years. They do not train you to react. They train you to assess. You gather information. You identify the objective. You plan the approach. You execute. Emotion is fuel, not a steering wheel. I felt rage that night, the kind that sits in your chest like a hot coal, but I did not act on it. I made a plan first. I drove to Knoxville the next morning, and I visited Walter's original attorney, a man named Gerald, who had handled the Delwood family's legal matters for 15 years. Gerald was not happy about what had happened. He told me the power of attorney was legally executed but potentially challengeable on grounds of undue influence given Walter's medical state at the time of signing. That process would take months and would require a court evaluation of Walter's competency. In the meantime, the document was valid. Then I visited 2 of Walter's longest-serving crew foremen, men who had worked for him for over a decade. They told me things had been strange at the company for months. Checks were slower. A contract they had always renewed automatically had not been renewed. The company credit card for materials had a new authorization requirement that sometimes held up job sites. They were worried. They asked me what was going on. I told them I was looking into it and I would be back in touch. Then I drove to Walter's house. It was a Tuesday, so my daughter-in-law was at the company office, which she had taken to visiting daily under the pretense of helping manage things while Walter recovered. My nephew was in Denver. Walter was home alone with a part-time nurse, who came 3 mornings a week. When Walter opened the door, I had to work hard to keep my face steady. He was thinner than I had seen him in years. He was moving carefully, the way a man moves when he is trying not to provoke the pain. He looked at me for a long moment and then he just said, "Frank," and his voice broke on that one word. We sat at his kitchen table and he told me everything. He told me about the medication schedule. He told me about the time she had let it slip that if he caused trouble, she would have him evaluated and placed in a memory care facility where he would have no access to the business at all. He told me about the way she spoke to him when no one else was in the room, the dismissals, the condescension, the way she had started calling him confused when he pushed back on anything. I looked at my brother across that table and I thought about the 30 years he had spent building something real, and I made a decision. I told him I needed 3 things from him. First, I needed him to write down every specific incident he could remember, dates and details, in a notebook I would bring him, and hide it somewhere she would not find it. Second, I needed him to act completely normal around her. No changes in behavior, nothing that would make her suspicious. Third, I needed him to tell me everything about her daily routine. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was going to spend some time in Knoxville. He asked where I would stay. I told him not to worry about that part. I rented a room at an extended stay motel 2 miles from his house, and I spent the next 5 days doing what I used to do for a living. I watched. I gathered information. I documented everything I could. I photographed her car at the company offices at hours when she had told Walter she was elsewhere. I obtained, through perfectly legal public record requests, the filings she had made using the power of attorney. I had a conversation with a former colleague of mine who now worked in financial fraud investigation, and he walked me through exactly what the paper trail was showing. She was not just controlling Walter. She was systematically liquidating assets, pulling value out of the company through a series of consulting invoices billed to a LLC registered in her maiden name in the state of Delaware. The invoices were for services the company had never actually received. She had been doing it for 8 months. By the conservative estimate my colleague helped me calculate, she had already moved over $200,000. This was not a power-hungry daughter-in-law. This was a calculated financial crime being committed against an injured elderly man by someone who had spent years positioning herself to do exactly this. I called Gerald the attorney and told him what I had found. He told me we needed to move, but we needed to move carefully, and we needed to do it in a way that created an undeniable record. He also told me that to challenge the power of attorney, we needed Walter to be formally evaluated by a physician who could attest that he was fully competent, which meant getting him to an appointment without her knowledge and without triggering whatever she had threatened him with. That was the part that required me to be creative. She had a standing Thursday morning meeting with the company's project manager that always ran 2 hours. Walter's nurse came on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings. On the Thursdays when the nurse was there, my daughter-in-law was at the office. That was my window. I called the nurse directly. I introduced myself as Walter's brother, explained I was concerned about his care, and asked if she would be willing to accompany him to a doctor's appointment on an upcoming Thursday as part of her duties. She said, of course, that was well within what she was hired to do. I made the appointment with a physician Gerald recommended, one who specialized in geriatric competency evaluations and who understood the legal context we were working with. I also asked the nurse, casually, whether she had observed anything about Walter's home environment that concerned her professionally. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was not comfortable speaking about her patient's private circumstances. I told her I understood completely. I told her that if she ever felt she was in a position where a patient's welfare required her to document something, she was legally protected as a mandatory reporter in the state of Tennessee. Another long pause. She said she appreciated knowing that. 3 days later, she filed a report with Adult Protective Services noting concerns about medication management and signs of social isolation in an elderly patient recovering from significant injury. The Thursday appointment went exactly as planned. Walter was evaluated for 2.5 hours. The physician concluded without reservation that he was fully competent, that there was no evidence of cognitive impairment, and that the circumstances under which the power of attorney had been signed raised serious clinical concerns about undue influence on a patient who had been medicated and concussed at the time of signing. That report went to Gerald within 24 hours. Now here is the part I have not told you yet. Because through all of this, my daughter-in-law had no idea I was in Knoxville. Walter had not told her. The nurse had not mentioned it. I had been careful about where I parked, careful about not being seen near the house on any day she might be there. As far as she knew, Walter's quiet brother Frank was 4 hours away in Chattanooga, probably sitting on his porch watching the sun set. Gerald filed the emergency petition to invalidate the power of attorney on a Friday afternoon. In Tennessee, when there is a concurrent Adult Protective Services report and a physician's competency evaluation on record, an emergency hearing can be expedited. We had a hearing date for the following Wednesday. She did not know the petition had been filed until Monday morning when she was served. I have been told by people who were in the company office that morning that the sound she made when she read those papers was something they had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. She called Walter immediately. He did not answer. She called 4 more times. He did not answer. She drove to the house. Walter's truck was not in the driveway, which was true, because I had borrowed it to run an errand, and Walter was sitting in Gerald's conference room going through documents with 2 attorneys and a forensic accountant. She left 3 voicemails. By the third one, her composure had slipped enough that the message was played in its entirety at the Wednesday hearing, in front of the judge, in front of my nephew, who had flown in from Denver that morning after Walter had finally called him and told him everything, and in front of the 2 crew foremen who had voluntarily submitted written statements about the irregularities they had observed over the previous 8 months. My nephew sat in that courtroom and listened to his wife's voice on that recording, threatening his father with a memory care facility if he did not, and I am quoting here, stop making trouble for everyone who is just trying to help him. He sat very still through the whole thing. He did not look at her once. The power of attorney was invalidated by noon. A temporary injunction was placed on all financial transactions she had been authorized to conduct on behalf of the company pending a full fraud investigation. The LLC in Delaware was flagged. The invoices were flagged. Gerald told us the district attorney's office had already been in contact after being notified by the APS investigator, who had been quietly building her own case since the nurse's report. None of that is the moment I want to tell you about, though. The moment I want to tell you about happened in the courthouse parking lot afterward. She walked out ahead of her attorney and she saw me standing next to Walter. I do not think she had known I was involved at all until that moment. She stopped walking. She looked at me and then at Walter and then back at me, and I could see her trying to recalculate everything in her head, trying to figure out how much I knew and for how long and what exactly I had done. I did not say anything to her. I just looked at her the way you look at something when you have already decided how it ends, and you are simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Her attorney touched her elbow and steered her toward their car, and she went. But she looked back once over her shoulder. Whatever she saw in my face made her walk faster. Walter stood next to me and watched them drive away. He had not said anything for a few minutes. Then he said, "You know, I almost did not call you. I almost talked myself out of it because I did not want to be a burden. I almost just let it keep happening." I told him that was the medication talking. That and 30 years of being the nice one. He laughed. It was a small laugh, the careful kind you do when your ribs are still healing. But it was real, and it was his, and I had not heard it in a long time. I want to say something here for anyone watching who is in a situation like Walter's, or who has a parent or a sibling who might be. The thing that makes these situations work for the person doing the harm is isolation. The moment you let someone cut you off from the people who would advocate for you, you have handed them the only tool they actually need. Walter was not weak. Walter was not foolish. Walter was targeted specifically because he was trusting and because he was surrounded by people who slowly, carefully, deliberately reduced his access to anyone who might see clearly what was happening. If you see a parent or a sibling or a friend pulling away from people who love them, or if you notice that someone new in their life seems to be managing their access to money, to communication, to medical care, pay attention. That is not caregiving. That is a mechanism. My nephew filed for divorce 6 weeks after the hearing. He called me the night he made that decision, and we talked for 2 hours. I did not tell him what to do. I listened. By the end of the call, he said, I kept choosing to believe her because believing her was easier than facing what it meant if she was lying. I said, that is the most honest thing I have heard anyone say in a long time. He is in Knoxville now. He has been working alongside Walter's crew foreman while the company gets back on its feet. He learns the names of every worker's kids, the same as his father always did. The criminal investigation concluded 4 months after the hearing. She was charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The charges carried potential prison time, and the full amount she had extracted was ordered to be repaid with interest as a condition of any plea arrangement. I am not going to tell you how that case ultimately resolved because some of it is still pending, and because that is not really the point of this story anyway. The point is, Walter. He is doing his physical therapy 3 times a week. His wrist has healed well enough that he can grip a handshake firmly again, which matters to him more than he would probably admit. He got a new cell phone on his own account with his own plan, and the first thing he did was call every number in his contacts list just because he could. He laughed about that later, said it was the best $240 he had spent in years. Last month he drove out to the lake house and he fixed those deck boards himself. He sent me a photo when he was done. Just a picture of the new boards, even and solid in a row, no caption. I knew what it meant. I pulled into his driveway 2 weekends ago. He was on the porch with a cup of coffee and he waved when he saw my truck. He looked like himself. He looked like the brother who used to drag me fishing at 4 a.m. when we were boys, who never once in his life took credit for something he did not do, who shook every worker's hand on payday and remembered every one of their children's names. We sat there until the sun went down and we did not talk about any of it. We talked about fishing. We talked about the Tennessee spring coming in green and loud after a long winter. We talked about the fact that he is thinking about taking on a new commercial contract that would be the biggest in the company's history, and that one of his foremen told him the crew would follow him anywhere he pointed. I believed that. I believed every word of it. Some people are worth 4 hours through the night. Some people are worth every quiet, careful, methodical thing you know how to do. My brother is one of those people. He always has been. And the woman who thought she could take everything he built because he was gentle and trusting and too decent to suspect the worst of someone he loved, she found out the hard way. That gentle does not mean alone. Trusting does not mean unprotected. And some of us who seem like we are just sitting on a porch in Chattanooga, watching sunsets and minding our own business, still know exactly what we are doing when it counts. Once a SEAL, always a SEAL. You do not forget what you were trained for. You just wait for the moment it matters, and when that moment comes, you do not get loud and you do not get sloppy. You get the job done. If you have someone in your life like my brother, someone good, someone who would never ask for help, be the person who shows up before they have to ask. Be the phone call they can make from a neighbor's house at dusk. Be the one who drives 4 hours in the dark and does not need to be thanked for it. That is what family is for. The rest of it is just noise.